Once upon a time, there was a little girl who lived in a village near the forest. Whenever she went out, the little girl wore a Red Riding cloak, so everyone in the village called her Little Red Riding Hood. One morning, Little Red Riding Hood asked her mother if she could go visit her grandmother, as it had been a while since they'd seen each other. "That's a good idea," her mother said. So they packed a nice basket for Little Red Riding Hood to take to her grandmother. When the basket was ready, the little girl put on her red cloak and kissed her mother goodbye. "Remember, go straight to Grandma's house," her mother cautioned. "Don't dawdle along the way, and please don't talk to strangers. The woods are dangerous." "Don't worry, Mother," said Little Red Riding Hood. "I'll be careful." But when Little Red Riding Hood noticed some lovely flowers in the woods, she forgot her promise to her mother. She picked a few, watched the butterflies flit about for a while, listened to the frogs croaking, and then picked a few more. Little Red Riding Hood was enjoying the warm summer day so much that she didn't notice a dark shadow approaching out of the forest behind her. Suddenly, the wolf appeared beside her. "What are you doing out here, little girl?" the wolf asked in a voice as friendly as he could muster. "I'm on my way to see my grandma, who lives through the forest near the brook," Little Red Riding Hood replied. Then she realized how late she was and quickly excused herself, running down the path to her grandma's house. The wolf, in the meantime, took a shortcut. The wolf, a little out of breath from running, arrived at Grandma's and knocked lightly on the door. "Oh, thank goodness, dear. Come in, come in. I was worried sick that something had happened to you in the forest," said Grandma, thinking that the knock was her granddaughter. The wolf let himself in. Poor Granny did not have time to say another word before the wolf gobbled her up. The wolf let out a satisfied burp and then poked through Granny's wardrobe to find a nightgown that he liked. He added a frilly sleeping cap and, for good measure, dabbed some of Granny's perfume behind his pointy ears. A few minutes later, Red Riding Hood knocked on the door. The wolf jumped into bed and pulled the covers over his nose. "Who is it?" he called in a cackly voice. "It's me, Little Red Riding Hood." "Oh, how lovely. Do come in, my dear," croaked the wolf. When Little Red Riding Hood entered the little cottage, she could scarcely recognize her grandmother. "Grandmother, your voice sounds so odd. Is something the matter?" she asked. "Oh, I just have a touch of a cold," squeaked the wolf, adding a cough at the end to prove the point. "But grandmother, what big ears you have," said Little Red Riding Hood as she edged closer to the bed. "The better to hear you with, my dear," replied the wolf. "But grandmother, what big eyes you have," said Little Red Riding Hood. "The better to see you with, my dear," replied the wolf. "But grandmother, what big teeth you have," said Little Red Riding Hood, her voice quivering slightly. "The better to eat you with, my dear," roared the wolf, and he leapt out of the bed and began to chase the girl. Almost too late, Little Red Riding Hood realized that the person in the bed was not her grandmother, but a hungry wolf. She ran across the room and through the door, shouting, "Help, wolf," as loud as she could. The woodsman who was chopping logs nearby heard her cry and ran towards the cottage as fast as he could. He grabbed the wolf and made him spit out the poor grandmother, who was a bit frazzled by the whole experience, but she was still in one is as blue as the prettiest cornflower and as clear as crystal. There lived a beautiful princess named Sarah. Sarah was very much like other princesses you may have met, with one small exception. Sarah was a mermaid. Now, we must not imagine that there is nothing at the bottom of the sea but bare yellow sand. No, indeed, the most amazing flowers and plants grow there. Colorful fish, both large and small, glide between the branches as birds fly among the trees here upon land. In the deepest spot of all stands the castle of the Sea King. Its walls are built of coral. The roof is formed of shells that open and close as the water flows over them. Their appearance is very beautiful, for in each lies a glittering pearl. The mermaid princess, Sarah, lived in this castle under the sea with her father, the king, and her 5 older sisters. All day long they played in the great halls of the castle. The large amber windows were open, and the fish swam up to the princesses and ate bits of food right out of their hands. Although Sarah loved her family and their peaceful blue world, she longed to one day see the sky, the moon, and, most especially, the humans she had heard so many stories about. When you have reached your 15th year, said her father, you will have permission to swim up out of the sea, to sit on the rocks in the moonlight, while the great ships are sailing by, and then perhaps you will see the humans you dream of. Sarah waited impatiently as each of her older sisters turned 15 and made their voyages to the surface world. They all told her of the wonders they saw above the surface, about waves crashing on rocks, the warmth of the sun, and the sounds of the seagulls in the air. Sarah's favorite story was the one her 3rd sister shared with her. She swam up a broad river that emptied itself into the sea. On the banks, she saw green hills where palaces and castles peeped out from amid the proud trees of the forest. She heard the birds singing and felt the warmth of the sun shining in the sky. In a narrow creek, she found a whole group of little human children playing in the water. She wanted to play with them, but they ran away as soon as they saw her. Just as she was about to leave, a little black and white animal came up to her. It had 4 legs and a waggy tail, but she did not know what it was, for she had never seen anything like it. The animal made such a loud woofing noise at her that she became frightened and rushed back to her home in the sea. But she told Sarah she would never forget the beautiful forest, the green hills, and the pretty little children who could swim in the water, although they had no fishtails. At last, Sarah reached her 15th year. Well, now you are old enough to make your visit to the surface, said her father a little sadly. Please be careful, for I love you very much. Sarah hugged her father and said farewell, then swam as lightly as a bubble to the surface of the water. The sun had just set as she raised her head above the waves. sat idle on deck or amongst the rigging. There was music and song on board, and as darkness came on, 100 colored lanterns were lighted to glow prettily in the night. The little mermaid swam close to the cabin windows. Now and then, as the waves lifted her up, she could look in through clear window panes and see a number of well-dressed people within. Among them was a young prince, the most handsome of all, with large brown eyes. He was 16 years of age, and his birthday was the reason for all the celebration. The sailors were dancing on deck, but when the prince came out of the cabin, more than 100 rockets rose in the air, making it as bright as day. The little mermaid was so startled that she dived underwater, and when she again stretched out her head, it appeared as if all the stars of heaven were falling around her. She had never seen such fireworks before. And how handsome the young prince looked as she shook the hands of all present and smiled at them while the music played in the clear night air. The party was so loud and the lights so bright that the sailors did not notice the lightning flashing in the sky. In what seemed like an instant, a raging storm blew across the ship. "Look out," screamed Sarah, but no one could hear her over the music and the storm. A fierce black wave crashed into the ship, tossing it violently, and, to her horror, Sarah saw the young prince was washed overboard, knocking his head against the railing as he fell. Sarah dove deeply under the dark waters, rising and falling with the waves, till at length she managed to reach the young prince. His eyes were closed, and he would have died had the little mermaid not come to his rescue. She held his head above the water and let the waves drift them where they could. As dawn broke, the storm ceased. Sarah pulled the prince onto the shore with the last of her strength. She then gently cradled him to keep him warm, and sang to him sweetly as the sun rose higher in the sky, and the color came back to his cheeks. Before the morning had passed, a young girl approached on the beach, and Sarah quickly hid. As the girl drew near, the handsome prince opened his eyes and whispered, "Thank you for saving me. You have a beautiful voice." "It isn't I who rescued you from the sea," the girl replied, "but I am so ever glad that I found you. The whole kingdom has been searching for you since late last night." Sarah dived down sorrowfully into the water and returned to her father's castle. She had always been silent and thoughtful, and now she was more so than ever. Her sisters asked her what she had seen during her first visit to the surface of the water, but she was too sad to share her story. For 2 whole days she wept alone in her room. On the morning of the 3rd day, Sarah woke up, having made a decision to go back to see the prince she had rescued. But she knew that her father would never allow her to return to the human world. Sarah decided that her only hope was to visit the witch of the ocean. The witch smiled when she saw the little mermaid approach knowingly in her magical way what it was the young girl wanted. "I warn you, girl," said the old woman, turning and holding a small bottle of black liquid out to Sarah. "In exchange for your wish to be human, you will have to give up your pretty voice. Unless your true love makes you his wife, you will never speak again, and you shall eventually die." The little mermaid carefully took the bottle from the witch and swam to the shore where she had last seen the prince. She sighed and looked sorrowfully at her fishtail Sarah gathered her courage, nodded quietly to herself, and drank the magic potion. A searing pain sliced through her, and she fainted. The prince was walking dreamily along the shore. For a moment, he thought his dream about a beautiful girl from the sea had come true when he discovered a young girl lying on the beach, wearing a most unusual dress of shining scales. He raced up just as the girl's eyes fluttered open. "Who are you, and how did you come to be here on the beach?" the prince asked gently. But Sarah could not answer, as her voice was gone with the drinking of the potion. So instead, she smiled prettily at him and leaned on his arm as he led her to his castle by the sea. When they arrived at the castle, the lords and ladies looked curiously at the young lady accompanying their prince, but before long, everyone in the castle became used to the quiet girl's presence, despite her strange habit of eating nothing but seaweed salads for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. The prince was very kind to Sarah and treated her like a little sister, but to Sarah's sorrow, his thoughts of love were with the human woman who found him on the beach while Sarah was hiding. She had the most beautiful blue eyes. She was only here for a short while, but I miss her so, the prince shared with Sarah as they were out for a walk in the garden. After a time, Sarah realized that the handsome prince would not be hers to marry. She felt so lonely, she thought her heart might break, but she was still happy that the prince was such a good friend. "I shall stay with him for as long as I can," Sarah decided. But she knew that when he finally married the woman he dreamt about, that she would die. For the witch's curse required that she marry her true love in order to become fully human. As winter ended and spring began, the day Sarah had been dreading finally arrived. The king from the neighboring country stopped by to visit and brought him his lovely daughter. As soon as the prince saw her, he rushed up and gazed into her eyes. "You," he exclaimed, "you are the one who found me on the beach." And with that, the couple quickly fell in love and made plans to marry. Sarah's sisters had kept track of her throughout her adventure in the human lands, and were horrified to think the dear little mermaid would die with the marriage of the happy couple. So they swam down to make their own deal with the witch of the sea. In exchange for their hair, the witch gave them a magical knife. As Sarah walked alone along the beach one morning, she saw her sisters out to sea. "Whatever happened to your beautiful hair?" she asked sadly. Her sisters replied, "We traded it with the witch for a magical knife." "You must kill the prince with it, and you will be returned to us as a mermaid under the sea. We miss you so and don't wish to see you die." Sarah smiled to her sisters and waved them farewell, but threw the knife deep into the ocean, for she knew she could never bring herself to kill the prince who she loved with all of her heart. And so the day came when the prince and princess were married. All of the kingdom rejoiced, even Sarah, who watched silently from the beach near the ocean, where once she had swam freely as a mermaid. Although she felt sorrow, Sarah was happy for the days she had spent with the prince, and happy that he had married his true love. As the couple kissed to seal their vows, Sarah felt a stab of pain and sank to the sand, with the waves washing over her. She thought to herself as she lay there, "So this is the end. How I wish I had longer to watch is to melt into the sea foam and rejoin the ocean that was once my home. Happily, the fairies of the air had been watching Sarah all this time, for they too were curious about the humans and had taken it as their task to watch over them. The eldest of the fairies fluttered down to Sarah and touched her lightly on the forehead. "Fear not, dear girl, for your love and acceptance has earned you a place with us. From now on, you shall be a child of the air and watch over the humans with kindness and compassion." And as the elder fairy lifted her hand, Sarah found herself becoming as light as a feather and sprouting wings. The little mermaid smiled brightly, for she could not think of a more wonderful life than fluttering through the air like a butterfly, and watching over the humans that she had first given up the sea to meet. This last story is called King Midas. In ancient Greece lived a king called Midas. He loved his daughter, but he was obsessed with gold. King Midas had more gold than any king in the world, but he wanted more. The king's daughter was called Goldie. She was just an ordinary kid and hated her father's obsession with gold and wished he would spend a bit more time with her instead. Late one evening, the king took a stroll through his rose garden. Suddenly, he tripped over something and almost fell flat on his face. He looked down and saw the weirdest looking creature. "Who the heck are you?" he exclaimed. "I'm a woodland creature and my name is Brian." "Are you all right? What are you doing sitting there on the ground anyway?" asked the king. The king took a look at the creature and saw a little man with a long, shaggy beard and what looked like shaggy fur trousers and hooves. "You don't look very well," said the king. "I got lost and tired and haven't eaten in days," said Brian. At that moment, Brian fainted. King Midas was actually very kind, so he picked Brian up and carried him into the palace. The servants fed him and put him to bed. Brian woke up the next morning and a little girl was watching him. It was Goldie, and she said, "My father, the king, said he found you in the rose garden last night. Did you sleep okay?" Brian yawned and said, "If it wasn't for your dad, I wouldn't have made it through the night. He's very kind." "Deep down, yes," she sighed. "He's a lovely father, but he's got this totally mad obsession with gold. I wish he would spend more time with me like he did before." Brian whispered in her ear and she looked amazed. They both went down to where the king sat at the breakfast table. "Ah, hello, Brian. Looking a lot better than last night, I must say. Breakfast?" "Yes, thank you. I am rather peckish." "Don't know what you woodland chaps eat, but I can have some hay brought in." "Toast will be fine," Brian said. "You have been very kind to me. You saved my life, and I have a magical gift I can give in special cases." "What is it?" asked the king. "A wish," said Brian, "and it will come true. Is there anything in particular that you would wish for? Maybe that everything you touched could turn to gold." "Yes, then I'd have all the gold I could ever want." "You sure?" asked Brian. The king nodded his head vigorously. Secretly, is now unwished, said Brian. Goldie instantly turned from a golden statue to the little girl once more, and the king picked her up and showered her lovely face with kisses. All the gold items in the palace returned to their natural state. Thank you, Brian. I've learned something important today, said the king. Goldie smiled a cute little smile up at her father, and she smiled back. Bring the head goldsman, commanded the king. The head goldsman said, What is it, sire? Have all the gold brought to the front of the palace. It is to be given away fairly to every person in the kingdom, cried the king. The celebrations lasted all day when everyone in the kingdom knew they would never have any more money worries. The head goldsman said, Sire, is there any point in you having a head goldsman? Good point, answered the king. The head rose gardener retires soon, so someone will need to look after all my lovely roses. From now on, you will be known as the head roseman.